All right, so move on to the final segment. I'll be sharing my fight prediction for this weekend's fight taking place in the sport of boxing between Chris Eubank Jr. and Connor Benn. So, in my opinion, the best fight that we've seen in 2025 in the sport of boxing, we get the highly anticipated rematch. And we are really lucky to get this rematch again in 2025. But the rematch is set to take place at middleweight. For those that don't know the weight of middleweight in boxing, that is a weight cut of 160 pounds with the rehydration clause still set at 170 pounds. So that means they got to make the weight at 160. Then they can only rehydrate to 170 pounds. So you can only rehydrate 10 pounds after making the weight to 160, just like how the clause was for the first fight. They're going to run the same clauses again for the highly anticipated rematch. But let's get into the storylines for this fight. Storyline number one is, can Chris Eubank Jr. continue to protect the family legacy? Now, we know the legacy between the Eubanks and the Benns. And this has been going on since the early 90s with Chris Eubank Sr. and Nigel Benn, the father of Connor Benn, fought each other twice in the late 90s, where it was Chris Eubank that knocked out Nigel Benn, and then the second fight, that fight went to a draw. So right now, and the family legacy between the Eubanks and the Benns, it's a combined record with father and son record of the Eubank family being up on the Benns 2-0-1. 2 wins, 0 losses, 1 draw. Chris Eubank, the father, Chris Eubank Jr. being successful against Nigel Benn and Connor Benn, with the draw happening between the two respective fathers, again happening in the early 90s. But we'll see if the Chris Eubank Jr. can protect the family legacy here. And can Connor Benn bounce back after suffering his first career loss? Now, again, the fight was built up for years, because we know that we were supposed to get this fight in 2022, but we know the story of Connor Benn being suspended from the sport of boxing, coming back months and months later, then finally getting this fight in 2025. And it was everything that we ever wanted for the fight, the first one. But I do give Connor Benn credit in losing effort for daring himself to be great, moving up 2 weight classes, because originally Connor Benn does fight at welterweight, making 147. So he moved up 2 weight classes to fight Chris Eubank Jr. And we're going to see if he can avenge his first and only loss in his boxing career. And we're going to see if he can make the adjustments needed to pick up the victory against Chris Eubank, finally win a family fight against the Eubanks, and avenge his first career loss in the sport of boxing. Last storyline is, will the rehydration clause play a factor here? Because the weight cut of making 160, then only being able to rehydrate to 170, that could be a lot for Chris Eubank Jr., like it was in the first fight. Now, he has openly complained about the rehydration clause, even as the winner in the first fight, saying that he had to go to the hospital after a dogfight between himself and Connor Benn. And he was in the hospital for 24 to 48 hours getting liquid IVs, IV fluids, after the brutal rehydration clause that was in TAC for the first fight. So we'll see if this plays a factor, and if Chris Eubank Jr. can relive another victory against Connor Benn in this fight. So enough of the storylines. Let's get into the tail of the tape here. Starting off with Connor Benn. Connor Benn has 23 victories, 1 loss to his boxing career. 14 victories come way of knockout. Stands at 5'8" with a reach of 68 inches. Then I'm looking at Chris Eubank Jr. Chris Eubank Jr. has 35 victories, 3 losses to his boxing career. 25 victories come way of knockout. Stands at 5'11" with a reach of 72 inches. So the height and the reach, again, goes in favor of Chris Eubank Jr. heading into this highly anticipated boxing rematch. So these are the following storylines that I have for these respective boxers to follow if they want to walk out a victory in this highly anticipated rematch. Starting off with Connor Benn. I think Connor Benn's going to have to fight in different lateral movements with constant head movement. And if Connor Benn can do that, like he did in the first fight, he did fight in different lateral movements. Constant head movement was a factor for him not getting caught or getting dropped in the first fight against Chris Eubank Jr. He did well in the first fight doing this. So I think he should do this again, fighting in different lateral movements, constant head movements to avoid the big strikes that Chris Eubank Jr. could be trying to unload on him, mixing the feints with the jab to make Chris Eubank reset his feet. And when he did that, mixing in the feints, struck with the jab, it made Chris Eubank struggle at times offensively, trying to get into a rhythm. He had to reset his feet a lot. So I think Connor Benn should do this in the rematch against Chris Eubank Jr. Next, I think Connor Benn should control the fight with his lead hand, and his lead hand is the left hand. When he was controlling the fight with his lead hand, the left hand, he actually controlled the pace of the fight against Chris Eubank Jr. in sequences in between rounds in this first fight between himself and Chris Eubank Jr. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And he had him second guessing what to do offensively in the first fight. When he did this, he found success using the jab, laying the left hook a lot. And I want to say this was the early part to the midway point of the fight that Connor Benn did this, and then he broke away from that broke away from those habits as the later rounds went on from round 7 to 12. But he found a lot of success doing this in the earlier part of the rounds. So I think Connor Benn should go back to doing this. And last but not least, turn this fight into a phone booth fight. Now, this is what I'm waiting for. If you guys remember, rounds 10, 11, and 12, they were all phone booth fights, phone booth rounds. But that's the best version that you get out of Connor Benn. Once he turns the fight into a phone booth fight, it's his world. And that's his bread and butter. And if he could get this fight into a phone booth fight against Chris Eubank Jr., split the high guard, land the 1-2 combinations, mix in some uppercuts, go to the body like he did in the first fight, especially, speaking of the body, that goes back to the point where I just said about the rehydration clause. The brutal cut, where you can only rehydrate up to 10 pounds, that weight limit of 170 that you can get into the ring with. So if he can land the body shots, that could possibly slow down Chris Eubank Jr., possibly land a knockdown or a knockout. So I think he should do all this and mix in the explosive shots. I think that's a really good game plan for Connor Benn to follow in the rematch against Chris Eubank Jr. Now, for Chris Eubank Jr., the following game plans. Now, before I get into game plans, it's very important to know that he's back with Bomac for this fight. Bomac is one of the best trainers that the sport of boxing has to follow. And we know that the creative work that Bomac was behind for Terrence Crawford to become a 3-time undisputed champion a few months ago when he defeated Canelo Alvarez on Mexican Independence Weekend. But for Chris Eubank Jr., I think he's got to fight behind the jab. Now, he did this a lot in the first fight, found a lot of success early fighting behind the jab in the early rounds. Landed, actually, when you look at the copy box stats, he actually landed 140 jabs against Connor Benn. That's 40% of the jabs that he landed against Connor Benn. So that was a good recipe for success in the first fight. I think he should go back to that. Next, I think he needs to win the counter-punching battle. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And there was a lot of sequences as the fight picked up and went on to the later rounds. He was getting the better of Connor Benn, winning the counter-punching battle. And he was faster than Connor Benn, more explosive, more precise as the later rounds went on to determine who was going to win the first fight. So if he could do that, that's going to wow the judges, get him some 10-9, possibly some 10-8 rounds as the fight goes on. But he did a good job of this, slipping underneath punches, connected well. And the inside, landing some counter shots to the body, 1-2 combinations, and mix it in some uppercuts as well. So I think this could be a really key strategy for Chris Eubank Jr. to follow in the rematch. But last but not least, the most important game plan for Chris Eubank is he has to be consistent. Now, he was very consistent in the first fight. He's got to stick to the game plan. He cannot let emotions get high. He has the abilities to outbox Connor Benn, because we saw in the first fight. And he can win rounds outboxing Connor Benn, because we've seen it in the first fight. And win the final rounds. He should be fine if he follows these game plans. And when he got cut in the 10th round, if you guys remember in that first fight, there was the accidental headbutt between Connor Benn and Chris Eubank Jr., which Chris Eubank Jr. got the worst of it. He got split and on his head and he was bleeding. After that, he just went off. And from rounds 10, 11, and 12, it was an aggressive dogfight from the rest of the rounds. For the final 9.5 minutes of that fight, Chris Eubank Jr. went into the deep waters and he drowned Connor Benn when he was consistent, followed the game plan, and when he knew he was at the end, he knew he had to pull away. This is why this fight was the best fight of 2025, because the more I break down about it, the more nostalgia breaks in, and I just think about the first fight more. But I think if both these respective fighters follow the game plans I just instructed for them, either one of them will get their hand raised Saturday in the sport of boxing. But with that being said, I'm going to go with Chris Eubank Jr. to defeat Connor Benn by decision this weekend in the sport of boxing. Now, the first fight between Chris Eubank Jr. and Connor Benn was an absolute banger. 2025 fight of the year, hands down. And we're lucky to get this fight a second time in 2025. So here comes round 2. But I think Chris Eubank Jr. in the rematch against Connor Benn will once again be the more polished fighter. He will outbox Connor Benn. He's going to control the fight with the jab like he did in the earlier rounds in the first fight against Connor Benn. And I think he's going to win the counter-punching battle once again. Last time he was more faster, more stronger, more explosive than Connor Benn in the counter-punching battle. He's going to set up traps for Connor Benn when he wants to fight on the inside. And I think this fight's going to come down to who wants him more in the later rounds like it did last time. And if you guys remember rounds 10, 11, and 12, again, when the accidental headbutt happened, where Chris Eubank Jr. got split open, that's when the fight became a dogfight. And if Chris Eubank is in a similar situation where he has to dig down deep, he's down in the judges' scorecards, and has to fight in the later part of the rounds, in the deep waters, my money's on him to pull it off compared to Connor Benn. But I think Chris Eubank Jr. has to stay disciplined. Plus, he needs to control the fight offensively, and it's a bonus for him to get Bo Mack, one of the best trainers in boxing, like I just said, back in his corner for this fight. Again, fight behind the jab. Also, he landed 140 jab punches against Connor Benn in the first fight, landing 40% of his jabs that he threw in the first fight. So I think Chris Eubank is just going to outbox Connor Benn. It's going to be another classic, an absolute banger, and I hope this fight can be as special as the first fight, possibly better than the second fight. But I think the chapter ends between the Eubanks and the Benns family here, with Chris Eubank getting another decision victory against Connor Benn this weekend in the sport of boxing. But that's all the time I have for you guys today. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you guys for listening. This is your host, Thomas Tyree, signing off. And I'll see you guys on next week's episode.